The fastest way to tell who has never seen a real legend is to listen to who laughs first. The operations center fell silent for half a second before a few quiet chuckles followed. Colonel Ryan Mitchell leaned back in his chair and looked at the personnel file displayed on the large screen at the front of the room. The name Emily Carter sat at the top, followed by a list of assignments that seemed impressive enough, but not enough to justify the whispers he had already heard since arriving at the forward operating base. Someone near the back of the room had just referred to her as a Navy SEAL legend. Ryan found the description amusing. In his 23 years of military service, he had met decorated officers, respected commanders, and highly skilled specialists. What he had learned was simple. The bigger the legend, the louder the story. Yet the woman standing quietly near the wall did not match the image that word created in his mind. Emily Carter did not stand in the center of the room. She did not introduce herself. She did not speak unless spoken to. While officers exchanged opinions and analysts reviewed maps, she simply watched. Ryan glanced toward her again. Nothing about her appearance demanded attention. Nothing about her posture suggested she wanted recognition. To Ryan, that only made the rumors seem even more exaggerated. He closed the personnel file and shook his head. A legend, he said with a faint smile. That is a pretty big title. Several officers laughed. A few exchanged knowing looks. Emily remained silent. She did not defend herself. She did not challenge him. She simply shifted her attention back toward the satellite imagery projected on the wall. The meeting continued. Their mission was becoming increasingly complicated. Hundreds of civilians remained trapped inside a densely populated district surrounded by hostile forces. Multiple rescue attempts had stalled. Political pressure was growing. News networks back home were beginning to ask difficult questions. Every hour mattered. Ryan directed the discussion with confidence. Teams reviewed possible routes, supply concerns, surveillance reports, and evacuation timelines. Opinions filled the room. Recommendations piled up. Through it all, Emily barely spoke. At one point, Ryan noticed her studying a specific section of terrain nearly 8 miles from the main objective. She stared at it longer than anyone else. He assumed she was simply reviewing the same information as everyone else. Across the table sat Master Chief Daniel Brooks, one of the most experienced operators on the base. Daniel had served long enough to recognize talent when he saw it. He caught Ryan's expression and quietly smiled. "You seem skeptical, sir." Ryan folded his arms. "Should I not be?" Daniel glanced toward Emily before answering. "You can be skeptical. Most people are at first." Ryan raised an eyebrow. And then, Daniel's smile faded. Then they stopped being skeptical. The answer lingered in Ryan's mind longer than he expected. Before he could respond, the briefing resumed. New intelligence arrived. Additional complications appeared. The mission was becoming harder by the hour. Yet while stress levels rose throughout the room, Emily Carter remained calm. She watched, listened, and took notes. No speeches, no boasts, no stories about past accomplishments. Just silence. The kind of silence that made experienced people curious. The meeting finally ended as evening settled across the desert. Officers gathered their folders and headed toward their assignments. Ryan remained behind for a moment, staring at the maps spread across the table. When he looked up again, Emily was already gone. Only Daniel remained. The Master Chief paused at the doorway and looked back. "For what it is worth, sir," he said, "if Emily Carter is here, our chances just improved." Ryan frowned. "Why?" Daniel opened the door. "That is the interesting part." He stepped into the hallway. Nobody ever knows why until it is too late to laugh. The desert night brought little relief from the pressure building across the base. Long after most personnel had returned to their quarters, lights still glowed inside the operations center. New intelligence reports continued arriving every hour, and none of them carried good news. The district they needed to reach remained isolated. Roads that looked usable on satellite images turned out to be blocked. Supply corridors disappeared as quickly as they were identified. Weather forecasts predicted worsening visibility over the next 48 hours. Every update seemed to remove another option from the board. Colonel Ryan Mitchell stood beside the main display reviewing the latest assessments. The room felt smaller than it had earlier in the day. Confidence was giving way to concern. Several officers proposed alternative approaches, but each plan created new problems. One route required resources they did not have. Another depended on information nobody could verify. A third looked promising until analysts calculated how much time it would take. Time was the one thing they were rapidly losing. Across the room, Emily Carter sat quietly with a notebook open in front of her. She had not participated in most of the discussion. To Ryan, it looked almost as if she were attending a completely different meeting. While everyone else focused on the district itself, her attention remained fixed on terrain far outside the immediate objective. More than once, Ryan caught himself wondering why. Near midnight, the briefing paused while updated imagery loaded onto the screens. Conversations broke out around the room. Some officers walked toward the coffee station. Others reviewed notes with their teams. Ryan noticed that Emily had moved closer to one of the displays. She was studying a narrow stretch of ground nearly 8 miles from the trapped civilian zone. There was nothing remarkable about it at first glance. No major roads, no strategic structures, no obvious reason for concern. Yet she continued examining it with unusual focus. Ryan finally walked over. "You have spent more time looking at that area than the actual objective," he said. Emily glanced toward him. Sometimes the most important part of a problem is not where everyone is looking. Ryan folded his arms. "And what exactly are you seeing?" Emily looked back at the image. "I am not sure yet." The answer irritated him more than he expected. The operation was running out of time, and she responded with uncertainty. Before he could press further, another officer called everyone back to the main table. The meeting resumed. New projections appeared on the screen. None of them improved the situation. By 2 in the morning, frustration had become impossible to hide. Voices grew sharper. Suggestions were challenged more aggressively. Even experienced personnel were beginning to show signs of fatigue. Through it all, Emily remained calm. She listened. She observed. She wrote occasional notes. Nothing more. As the meeting finally ended, Ryan felt no closer to a solution than he had 12 hours earlier. Officers slowly filtered out of the room. Daniel Brooks remained behind once again. He watched Emily leave before turning toward Ryan. "You are trying to figure her out," Daniel said. Ryan did not deny it. "I am trying to figure out why everyone treats her like she already knows something the rest of us do not." Daniel nodded. "That is because she usually does." Ryan sighed. "That sounds more like mythology than military planning." Daniel smiled slightly. "The difference is that mythology is usually invented afterward." Ryan looked toward the door Emily had just exited through. Somewhere beyond the walls of the operations center, a solution either existed or it did not. What bothered him was the growing feeling that Emily Carter might already be closer to finding it than anyone else in the room. The next morning began before sunrise. The operations center slowly filled with exhausted personnel, carrying fresh reports and unfinished questions. Nobody had found the breakthrough they needed. The district remained isolated, and every projection suggested the situation would become more complicated if another day passed without progress. Colonel Ryan Mitchell stood beside the main display reviewing overnight intelligence while analysts updated maps and surveillance feeds. As he listened to the latest briefing, he noticed something unusual. Emily Carter was not looking at the primary objective at all. Instead, she was studying historical satellite images dating back several years. Ryan walked closer. On the screen appeared a series of photographs showing the same stretch of terrain taken months apart. At first glance, nothing seemed important. The ground looked empty. A few dirt roads crossed the landscape. Small structures appeared and disappeared over time. To Ryan, it looked like routine environmental change. Emily continued comparing images without saying a word. "What are you looking for?" Ryan finally asked. "Patterns," she replied. "Patterns in what?" She zoomed in on a section of land several miles away from the district. "Patterns in what people ignore." Ryan stared at the screen. He still did not see anything significant. Nearby officers glanced over but quickly returned to their assignments. Everyone was focused on immediate problems. Nobody had time for theories. Yet Emily continued studying the imagery with remarkable patience. Hours passed. Meetings came and went. Analysts presented updates. Communications teams coordinated with units in the field. Through it all, Emily remained focused on the same area. By early afternoon, Ryan's curiosity had grown stronger than his skepticism. He walked over again and found her comparing vehicle movement records with weather data and supply reports. The combination seemed unrelated. "Help me understand this," he said. Emily looked up. "Everyone assumes the district is the center of the problem." "Because it is." "No," she answered calmly. "It is the center of attention. That is not always the same thing. Ryan frowned. Before he could respond, Emily pointed toward the map. If supplies reached that district consistently for months, they had to come through somewhere. If information moved in and out, there had to be a route. If people adapted to changing conditions, they followed habits. Habits leave traces. Ryan studied the screen again. This time he noticed something. Tiny changes appeared across multiple images. Not enough to stand out individually, but together they suggested a recurring pattern. A narrow corridor showed signs of repeated activity despite appearing insignificant on standard maps. "You think this matters?" he asked. Emily nodded slightly. "I think it matters enough to investigate." An officer nearby overheard the conversation and shook his head. "That route is too small to be relevant." Another analyst agreed. "We checked major access points weeks ago." Emily did not argue. She simply returned to her notes. Ryan watched the exchange carefully. Most people would have defended their theory. Most people would have tried to convince the room. Emily seemed completely comfortable allowing others to disagree. That confidence unsettled him more than any debate could have. Late that afternoon, Master Chief Daniel Brooks entered the room carrying a stack of reports. He noticed the map on Emily's screen and smiled immediately. "Interesting," he said. Ryan looked at him. "You recognize it?" Daniel nodded. "Not the location. The process." "Meaning?" Daniel set the reports down. "Most people search for answers. Emily searches for what everyone else missed." Ryan looked back at the map. For the first time since arriving at the base, he began to wonder whether the solution to the entire operation had been sitting in plain sight all along, hidden inside details nobody considered important enough to examine. By the following morning, the atmosphere inside the operations center had changed. The confidence that filled the room during the first briefings had been replaced by urgency. New reports showed that conditions around the district were becoming more unpredictable, and pressure from higher command continued to grow. Colonel Ryan Mitchell knew that waiting much longer was not an option. The operation needed momentum. It needed results. Most of all, it needed a plan that could work. After reviewing every recommendation submitted during the previous 48 hours, Ryan made a decision. He approved a large-scale approach that had broad support among his senior officers. The strategy relied on multiple teams moving simultaneously through routes that analysts believed were the most practical. It was not perfect, but it was the strongest proposal currently available. During the final briefing before deployment, Emily Carter sat quietly near the back of the room. The same map remained open in front of her. The same narrow corridor she had been studying for days was highlighted in her notes. Ryan noticed it immediately. "Do you still think that route matters?" he asked. Emily looked up. "I think it matters more than anyone realizes." Several officers exchanged glances. One of them smiled politely. Another shook his head. They had heard the argument before. To them, the corridor remained little more than an interesting observation. Ryan considered her answer for a moment. "The operation moves forward as planned," he said. Emily simply nodded. There was no argument. No attempt to persuade him. No effort to challenge his authority. That response surprised him. Most specialists fought hard for their ideas. Emily accepted the decision and returned to her notebook. Hours later, updates began arriving from the field. At first, everything appeared normal. Teams reached their designated positions. Communications remained stable. Progress reports sounded encouraging. The operations center relaxed slightly. Some officers even began discussing what the next phase might look like. Then the situation changed. New information started appearing faster than expected. Routes that looked promising on paper created delays. Timelines shifted. Coordination became more complicated. Resources had to be redirected. None of the problems were catastrophic by themselves, but together they produced a troubling pattern. The operation was slowing down. Ryan watched the incoming reports with growing concern. Every adjustment seemed to create another obstacle somewhere else. Analysts worked furiously to update projections. Officers revised recommendations. Yet the more data they gathered, the clearer one reality became. The plan was not delivering the breakthrough everyone expected. Late that evening, Ryan stood alone in front of the main display studying the latest updates. Behind him, conversations filled the room. Frustration was becoming impossible to hide. For the first time since taking command of the mission, he found himself questioning assumptions he had considered obvious only days earlier. As he reviewed the maps again, his eyes drifted toward the section of terrain Emily had been studying. The narrow corridor seemed insignificant compared to the larger operation. Yet somehow it continued appearing in his thoughts. At that moment, Daniel Brooks stepped beside him. The Master Chief studied the screen for several seconds before speaking. You know what the hardest thing is for experienced leaders? Ryan glanced toward him. What? Daniel folded his arms. Accepting that the answer might be hiding in the one place everyone agreed to ignore. Ryan looked back at the map. Across the room, Emily remained focused on her notes, calm despite the growing tension around her. For the first time, Ryan wondered whether the operation's biggest mistake had not been choosing the wrong route. Perhaps the real mistake had been overlooking the one person who kept looking where nobody else bothered to look. The operations center felt unusually quiet the next morning. Nobody needed to say what everyone already understood. The previous plan had consumed valuable time without producing the breakthrough they needed. Screens continued displaying maps, forecasts, and intelligence updates, but the confidence that once accompanied those reports had faded. Colonel Ryan Mitchell stood near the central display, studying the latest information while analysts moved between workstations. For the first time since arriving at the base, he found himself paying less attention to the largest routes on the map and more attention to the smallest one. The narrow corridor Emily Carter had been examining for days remained highlighted on a secondary screen. It looked insignificant compared to everything surrounding it. Yet somehow it continued attracting his attention. Across the room, Emily sat alone reviewing a collection of satellite images spread across multiple monitors. Ryan walked over and stopped beside her workstation. She did not immediately notice him. Her focus remained fixed on a sequence of photographs taken months apart. Ryan watched quietly. This time he forced himself to look at the images the way she did. Not for dramatic changes. Not for obvious structures. He searched for subtle differences. Small details. Repeating patterns. After several moments, he finally saw it. The same path appeared again and again under different conditions. The route looked unimportant, yet traces of activity never completely disappeared. Vehicles changed. Weather changed. Temporary structures appeared and vanished. But the pattern remained. Ryan frowned. You have been tracking this for 3 days. Emily nodded. 4. What makes you so certain it matters? For the first time, she turned away from the screen and looked directly at him. Because everything else changes. Ryan waited for more. Emily pointed toward the images. When people want you to notice something, they create movement. When they want you to ignore something, they create routine. This route looks routine. That is exactly why it interests me. Ryan studied the photographs again. The explanation sounded simple, but the more he considered it, the more difficult it became to dismiss. Throughout the day, Emily continued gathering information. She compared logistics reports, weather records, old reconnaissance notes, and archived satellite imagery. Piece by piece, a larger picture began emerging. What had once appeared random now looked organized. What had once appeared ordinary now seemed deliberate. Late that afternoon, Ryan called a smaller strategy meeting. Unlike previous briefings, this one included only a handful of senior personnel. Emily presented her findings without exaggeration. She did not claim certainty. She did not promise success. She simply showed evidence. Several officers remained skeptical. One analyst argued that the corridor could still be meaningless. Another suggested that resources should remain focused elsewhere. Emily listened without interruption. When everyone finished speaking, she calmly returned to the images. You might be right, she said. Maybe it means nothing. But if it means something, it changes everything. The room fell silent. Ryan looked around the table. For days, people had offered theories built on assumptions. Emily offered observations built on evidence. The difference was becoming impossible to ignore. As the meeting ended, Ryan remained seated while the others filed out. Emily gathered her notes and prepared to leave. Before she reached the door, Ryan spoke. If this corridor is what you think it is, why did nobody find it before? Emily paused. A faint smile appeared on her face. Because most people look for what they expect to find. She opened the door and stepped into the hallway. Ryan remained alone with the maps. For the first time, he was no longer asking whether Emily Carter knew something others did not. He was beginning to wonder how many times in her career she had seen answers hidden in plain sight, while everyone else searched somewhere else. The following morning began with a level of focus the operations center had not seen since the mission started. For the first time, discussions were no longer centered on what had failed. They were centered on what might finally work. Colonel Ryan Mitchell entered the briefing room carrying a folder filled with updated intelligence. The narrow corridor that had once been dismissed now occupied a prominent position on the main display. Analysts had spent the entire night examining the area from every available angle. What they discovered did not provide complete answers, but it confirmed something important. Emily Carter had been right about one thing. The corridor was not random. Activity patterns stretched back months. Supply movements appeared irregular on the surface, yet they followed a rhythm that only became visible when viewed across long periods of time. Ryan stood before the room and reviewed the findings. Several officers who had previously doubted the corridor now paid close attention. Others remained cautious. Nobody wanted to commit valuable resources to a theory that could still prove incomplete. When Ryan finished speaking, he turned toward Emily. "You have the floor." The room became silent. Emily stood and walked to the display. She did not begin with a dramatic statement. She did not try to impress anyone. Instead, she showed a sequence of images collected over multiple years. One after another, small details appeared. Vehicle tracks, temporary storage locations, repeated movement during specific weather conditions. Changes that seemed meaningless individually but revealed a pattern when combined. "Everybody focused on the destination," she said calmly. Nobody focused on the habit. Several officers exchanged curious looks. Emily continued. "People can change plans. They can change routes. They can change schedules. Habits are harder to change." She highlighted a section of terrain nearly 8 miles from the district. This area became predictable because everyone assumed it was unimportant. Ryan watched the room carefully. Something had changed. For the first time since Emily arrived, nobody was dismissing her observations. They were listening. An analyst raised a hand. "What exactly are you proposing?" Emily zoomed in on the corridor. "A small reconnaissance operation. Nothing large. Nothing complicated. We verify what the pattern suggests." Another officer frowned. "And if the pattern is wrong?" Emily nodded. "Then we lose very little and eliminate a possibility. If the pattern is right, we gain something far more valuable than another theory." The answer hung in the room. Ryan studied the faces around the table. Resistance remained, but certainty had disappeared. Hours earlier, most of these people would have rejected the proposal immediately. Now they were considering it. After the meeting ended, Ryan asked Emily to stay behind. The room gradually emptied until only the two of them remained. He looked at the maps covering the display wall. "You never push your ideas," he said. Emily smiled faintly. "Good ideas do not need to be pushed. They only need enough time to be seen." Ryan thought about that for a moment. Throughout his career, he had met people who fought for attention. Emily seemed completely uninterested in it. Her focus remained fixed on solving problems rather than receiving credit. "Do you really believe this corridor changes everything?" he asked. Emily looked toward the highlighted route. "No," she replied. "I think it reveals something that changes everything." Ryan followed her gaze. For days, he had searched for a solution hidden inside the obvious. Emily had searched for a question hidden inside the overlooked. And for the first time, he realized those were not the same thing at all. The reconnaissance operation launched before dawn. Unlike the larger plans that had dominated previous discussions, this one relied on patience rather than scale. A small team was assigned to verify the observations Emily Carter had spent days developing. Inside the operations center, tension remained high. Colonel Ryan Mitchell stood beside the main display as live updates arrived. Nobody claimed certainty. Nobody promised success. The mission was designed to answer a question, not solve the entire problem. Yet everyone understood that the answer could determine the direction of everything that followed. Hours passed. Analysts monitored incoming information while communications specialists tracked every update. At first, the reports seemed ordinary. The corridor appeared exactly as it had on satellite images. Quiet, unremarkable, easy to overlook. Several officers exchanged skeptical glances. One analyst quietly suggested that they might be chasing shadows. Another pointed out that valuable resources had already been spent investigating a route that still looked insignificant. Ryan listened without responding. He found himself doing something he would not have done a week earlier. He was waiting for Emily's assessment before drawing conclusions. Across the room, Emily remained focused on the data. She watched every report with the same calm concentration she had shown from the beginning. No frustration, no anxiety, No attempt to convince anyone. Just observation. Then, shortly after midday, the first unusual detail appeared. It was small enough that most people missed it. A logistics specialist almost dismissed it as routine. Emily noticed it immediately. She asked for historical records. Minutes later, additional information arrived. The pattern she had predicted began revealing itself. Activity that seemed random when viewed over a few hours became remarkably consistent when compared with months of archived data. The corridor was not simply being used. It was being relied upon. Analysts quickly began connecting separate pieces of information that previously appeared unrelated. Supply movements matched weather trends. Communication gaps aligned with transportation records. Temporary structures appeared exactly where Emily predicted they would. One by one, assumptions that had guided the operation started collapsing. The room grew quiet. Officers who had challenged her theory leaned forward in their seats. Analysts requested additional screens. New maps appeared across the display wall. What everyone was witnessing was not luck. It was the result of seeing connections nobody else had recognized. Ryan stared at the evidence unfolding in front of him. The corridor had revealed something larger than a route. It had exposed an entire framework for understanding the area. Suddenly, obstacles that seemed disconnected began making sense. Questions that had frustrated planners for weeks now had context. For the first time since the operation began, the mission no longer felt trapped. Late that afternoon, Ryan gathered the senior staff. The atmosphere inside the briefing room was completely different from earlier meetings. Skepticism had been replaced by attention. Every person present wanted to hear what Emily would say next. She stepped to the front and reviewed the latest findings. When she finished, nobody interrupted. Nobody dismissed her conclusions. The silence itself felt remarkable. Finally, one officer spoke. "If you saw this days ago, why did you not push harder?" Emily considered the question. Because people trust what they discover more than what they are told. The room remained silent again. Ryan looked around the table. Days earlier, he had laughed at the idea that Emily Carter might be exceptional. Now he was beginning to understand something important. Her greatest strength was not experience, rank, or reputation. It was the ability to see significance where everyone else saw nothing. And for the first time, the entire operation was starting to move in the direction she had seen from the very beginning. Over the next 24 hours, the operation transformed completely. What had once been a mission dominated by uncertainty now moved with purpose. The information uncovered through Emily Carter's observations allowed planners to rethink assumptions that had guided every previous decision. Analysts rebuilt models. Logistics teams adjusted schedules. Intelligence officers reviewed old reports with fresh perspective. Piece by piece, the larger picture came into focus. Inside the operations center, the atmosphere felt lighter than it had in days. Not because the mission had become easy, but because people finally understood the environment they were working within. Colonel Ryan Mitchell watched the change unfold with growing respect. The most surprising part was not that Emily had been correct. The most surprising part was how calmly she treated the discovery. While officers congratulated analysts and teams celebrated progress, Emily continued working as though nothing extraordinary had happened. She spent her time reviewing new information, refining details, and searching for weaknesses in assumptions. It was the behavior of someone who cared more about outcomes than recognition. Late that evening, Ryan found himself unable to ignore a question that had been growing in his mind since the operation began. He walked into the administrative section of the base and requested access to archived personnel records. Emily's official file appeared on his screen. At first, it looked similar to what he had already seen. Assignments, evaluations, training records, commendations. But then he noticed references to reports that required additional authorization. Curious, he requested access. The screen paused for several seconds before loading a new set of documents. Ryan leaned forward. What he found surprised him. The records did not describe dramatic stories or sensational achievements. Instead, they revealed a pattern. Again and again, Emily appeared in missions where success depended on recognizing details others overlooked. Reports from different years described situations in which her observations changed operational planning. Commanders praised her judgment. Analysts referenced her assessments. Senior leaders requested her involvement in complex missions. Yet despite the impressive record, one thing stood out. Emily was rarely the most visible person in any report. Her role often appeared in the background. She was not the person giving speeches. She was not the person standing in front of cameras. She was simply the person who noticed what everyone else missed. Ryan continued reading. The deeper he went, the more he understood why experienced personnel reacted differently whenever Emily entered a room. They were not impressed by stories. They were responding to history. Across multiple assignments and over many years, she had earned a reputation through consistency rather than publicity. Meanwhile, elsewhere on the base, preparations continued. Teams refined plans using the latest intelligence. Coordination improved. Confidence returned. For the first time since arriving, people spoke about the mission as something achievable rather than something slipping away. Near midnight, Ryan stepped outside the operations center for a moment of quiet. The desert air felt cooler than usual. Across the compound, he spotted Emily sitting alone with a notebook in her hands. She was reviewing information beneath a small light outside one of the buildings. She looked exactly the same as she had on the first day. No different. No more dramatic. No more impressive. Yet Ryan now understood something he had completely missed before. The people who called her a legend had never been talking about fame. They had been talking about trust. And trust, he realized, was earned one correct observation at a time. 3 days later, the atmosphere across the base felt entirely different. The mission that had once seemed trapped by uncertainty had reached a successful conclusion. Planning teams had used the intelligence gathered from the corridor to make better decisions, avoid costly mistakes, and coordinate efforts with a level of confidence that had been missing from the beginning. Inside the operations center, conversations no longer revolved around obstacles. They revolved around lessons learned. Analysts reviewed reports. Officers completed summaries. Personnel who had spent days under intense pressure finally allowed themselves to relax. Yet one thing remained unchanged. Emily Carter continued moving through the base exactly as she always had. She did not seek attention. She did not discuss her role. She did not remind anyone that her observations had altered the direction of the entire operation. To her, the mission was simply another problem that needed solving. Colonel Ryan Mitchell noticed that more than anyone. During the days that followed, he found himself thinking about their first meeting. He remembered the laughter in the briefing room. He remembered the confidence with which he dismissed the idea that she could be as capable as people claimed. Most of all, he remembered Daniel Brooks telling him that people stopped being skeptical once they understood who Emily really was. Now Ryan understood exactly what Daniel meant. Early one morning, before most of the base had started its daily routine, Ryan walked into the operations center carrying a folder. Inside were copies of reports he had reviewed during the previous week. They described years of service, difficult assignments, and a reputation built not on publicity, but on results. As personnel gradually filled the room, Ryan called for a brief gathering. Officers, analysts, and support staff assembled around the central display. Emily happened to be there reviewing final documentation before her departure. She looked mildly surprised by the unexpected meeting. Ryan stepped forward. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then he looked directly at Emily. "A week ago," he began, "I thought experience meant having the answers. This mission taught me that experience often means knowing which questions to ask." The room became silent. Several people exchanged curious glances. Ryan continued. "Many of us spent our time searching where everyone else was looking. One person spent her time searching where nobody else bothered to look. Because of that, we understood the situation more clearly. Because of that, better decisions became possible. Because of that, this mission moved forward." Emily lowered her eyes slightly, clearly uncomfortable with being the center of attention. Ryan smiled. "I also learned something else. Real expertise does not announce itself. It does not demand recognition. It simply keeps showing up when it matters." Around the room, heads nodded in agreement. Some of the same officers who had doubted her during the first meetings now looked at her with genuine respect. Daniel Brooks stood near the back of the room, wearing the expression of someone who had known this outcome was inevitable from the very beginning. Ryan then did something nobody expected. He stood at attention. The room immediately fell silent. Every eye turned toward him. Without hesitation, he offered a formal salute. For a brief second, Emily looked genuinely surprised. Then she returned the gesture. No speeches followed. No dramatic celebration. No applause. None was necessary. The meaning of the moment was already understood by everyone present. The respect in the room had been earned, not requested. Later that morning, as the sun rose over the desert horizon, Emily departed the base as quietly as she had arrived. She left behind no grand farewell and no attempt to claim credit. Yet long after she was gone, people continued talking about the lesson she had taught them. The most important person in the room is not always the loudest. The most valuable insight is not always the most obvious. And sometimes the difference between failure and success begins with a detail so small that only one person thinks it is worth noticing.